as Corey mentioned, I shared my story last night, so I want to just go a little bit in a different direction today, something I don't get to talk about as much, which is the issue of forgiveness. It's such a difficult topic, especially those who've been traumatized. For many survivors of sexual abuse, it's something that will immediately cause you to shut down, and that was my situation for many, many years. And what changed things for me was understanding what forgiveness was and was not. My husband's family is from New England, whatever you call it, but like all along the coast, his family grew up, and his sister lives in New Hampshire, and so their family came to visit us in Ohio for a weekend recently. And on the last day of their visit, my little niece lost her first tooth. And she was so excited about losing her tooth, and she couldn't stop talking about the tooth fairy that was going to be coming that night. So she took her tooth everywhere we went. And it was Sunday, she took it to church. And then we went out to eat after church. She took it to City Barbecue with us, and she set it on her little tray next to her baked beans. And, and I'm just always, when the in-laws are in town, I'm like trying to be like the perfect wife or whatever. So I'm like cleaning up after everyone and like taking care of everything. And then, of course, I dumped her tray into the trash with her tooth, and she was devastated, and it was horrible, and I felt so bad. And I'm like, I'm not gonna go through this trash for her tooth with all these other nasty strangers' foods. So that happened, and then she ended up going home and writing a letter to the tooth fairy, asking the tooth fairy to forgive me and then to still give her grace and give her a quarter, even though she would not have a tooth to give to the tooth fairy. And I just felt so bad. I left her like a $10 bill. I was like, oh, Lord, please see this, what I'm doing, But the fact that she asked the tooth fairy to forgive me, I just love that so much. And, for me, it was like she was saying, if the fairy can forgive my aunt, then I can forgive her too, right? But I think in adulthood, it's not really that easy, is it? We develop a lot of confusion and misconceptions about what it really is to forgive. And I think a lot of us, at least myself personally, as I'll get into my story a little bit more, but can really buy into the lies about forgiveness, because I think in some sense, if you look at it in a spiritual way, it's a great way for the enemy of our souls to really keep us chained to our pain and keep us stuck in the past and connected even to a person who has caused pain in our lives. But according to Scripture, forgiveness is God's only solution to bitterness. And it's hard to understand, though, but I found that once we can shine light on some of the lies that maybe we believed, maybe didn't even realize we were believing, it can bring a lot of freedom. I found that forgiveness in my life was this spiritual transaction that could not be explained. It was only understood between myself and God. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of my story with you. And C.S. Lewis wrote, "Everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until there's something to forgive." He wrote that in Mere Christianity, and that has really resonated with me. People love a good story, of forgiveness until it's your story. And it's hard to really wrap your mind around. And for those of you who are once like I was, you may struggle with that term. And it may even be triggering for you. And you may want to run up here and hit me over the head with, this computer, just thinking about a certain situation or a certain person in your life that's caused you so much pain. For me, as a sexual abuse survivor, when someone would bring that up to me, it was very difficult for me, and in fact caused me to distance myself from a person who would push that sort of term on me when it came to my abuse. So I just ask for those of you who that might hit to just bear with me to the end. And I think that as you hear some of the lies and some of the truths that have changed my life, maybe that would shine some new light on your life too. Because lies get bigger, I think, when we believe them. But truth gets bigger when we believe it too. And that's been my story. I speak and I write books on the topic of sexual violence, and I've been a public voice for, like Corey said, for 17 years now. And it took a long, hard process for me to find my voice, and the process is not over because healing is a lifelong journey. And growing up, I endured 10 years of sexual abuse by my stepdad. From the age of 4, that was my first memory, until 14, I kept his secrets. And I carried so much shame, so much confusion in my life for so many years. Inside I felt dirty and I felt damaged, but on the outside I painted on the happy face, and I was, a super achiever in everything that I did. And my coping mechanisms were a lot of people pleasing and perfectionism, doing everything I could to be what everybody else wanted me to be. But it was exhausting. And there was such a big part of me that wanted to feel free. And I think that the chains that I had were wrapped around shame, for one, but also just around not being able to talk freely about my story, how it affected me, and then this whole confusion about what forgiveness really looked like. And I remember when I was a sophomore in college, I was a basketball player at my college, and so everyone kind of knew me. I was on a small campus, and I remember the day that I finally decided to go to our counseling center. There was one sidewalk that went to the counseling center, so it was like if you were on that sidewalk, everybody knew that you were going to go talk to somebody. And so that alone was very hard for me. And so I remember, making that huge step, and I have all this bitterness and this anger and this stuff that's messing with my relationships, and I need to go talk and work through this. And so I felt so proud of myself, but I didn't want anyone else to know. So I put on my hoodie and I pulled it really tight, and I had a peephole, just to be able to walk down that sidewalk so no one would see me. And then I realized my number was on the back of my sweatshirt. I was not the brightest soul, but but that was a season of healing that I needed to allow myself to get angry. And I think for so long, being the perfectionist and the people pleaser, I was always the one that said I was fine, on the outside. And I would say that I had forgiven my stepdad because I knew, in my community and in my church, that's what I was supposed to do. But that was just all a mask, because what was on the inside was a lot of anger that needed to come out, and it was righteous anger, and it was right, because what happened to me was unjust, but I was never allowed to have the language. And so having that safe place, that whole sophomore year, to really look at what happened to me and see it as wrong and be mad about the losses that I had gone through, and to be able to grieve the things, that was a huge first step of understanding what forgiveness was, because I was able to drop the masks for an hour a week. Do you know what I mean? And get really vulnerable. And it was only after that process that I could begin to understand forgiveness, and then understand the freedom that was found there. When we don't understand something well, we don't apply it well, and it can be really damaging to somebody who is carrying pain. So forgiveness is a difficult, sensitive term for those who've experienced an intimate evil, but the truths of forgiveness during that season in my life were absolutely the key to unlocking so many chains and allowing me to finally find my voice to, be able to talk about my story the way that I do now. But not being able to forgive kept me so stuck. It really did. And I felt tied to my abuser, tied to the pain that it caused me, and deprived really of the future that I believe God had planned for me, because I was so stuck there. And we'll get to that part of my story later, but I realized that forgiveness does not mean that we forget. It does not mean that we condone. It does not mean that we approve what was done. It doesn't mean we ignore or excuse cruelty or injustice. What it means is that we're released from it. Forgiveness is a way in which we realign our lives with God's plan. And so, as I had researched a lot of, scriptures based on this, there's a lot of verses in the Bible that talk about forgiveness, and God's forgiveness and human forgiveness are very related. And as I read many of them, it was still difficult for me as a survivor to believe, that it was still part of my story, that I still needed to grasp it because it just felt so big. But abuse survivors like me often believe that by withholding forgiveness, we're getting back our control, if that makes any sense, or taking justice into our own hands. But in the end, it never makes us feel better. It still feels like prison. And so knowing that God paid such a high price to be able to forgive those who've sinned against him, I've found that we've also must forgive those who've sinned against us, but it looks a little bit different than what we believe. So what forgiveness is not. The first one, forgiveness is about the person who hurt me, and that is a lie. So forgiveness is not about that. Forgiveness is about me. So I reached a point in my healing when I felt ready. I was going through this counseling for about a full year, my sophomore year of college, like I mentioned, and I felt ready to take this big step forward in forgiveness because I started to understand some of the things I'm going to unpack, but started to really understand what forgiveness was and how it was the key to some of my freedom. And if you weren't there last night, you wouldn't know that I told my mom when I was 14 years old, and my mom believed me. And in fact, we left our home and we were in hiding because my stepfather was threatening to kill us, take our lives. And so we were going through that whole process. And at the end of the week, my stepfather actually eventually took his own life. And so his death, for some people, I've been to a lot of places and they would say, well, how could you forgive because he wasn't alive? And so that's another part of my story is it was not about him. It was about me. So forgiveness was possible for me because it had nothing to do with him as a person. His death did not mean I couldn't go forward. It only emphasized the fact that forgiveness was about my journey, and it's about the power of abuse and breaking the power over my life. So I felt still chained to my stepdad, even as I was in college. The impact of his choices on my life were still there. So forgiveness for me meant breaking those chains free. Forgiveness is what would free me to move forward. And I remember at one point in college when I was kind of working through this whole process, and I had woken up one morning in my dorm and I had just woken up from sort of a dream about my stepdad and I remember I fell asleep actually journaling and praying about this whole issue of forgiveness and just wanting freedom and didn't want to feel so connected to him all the time. And I had this vision of where I was connected to my stepfather with a rope, and it was like everywhere I went, I was like dragging him with me. It was just like pulling me down. And so I fell asleep that night and I woke up that morning and I was sort of like in this dream where I saw myself facing my stepfather, and I was crying and I was just so upset at what he had done and the sexual abuse I'd gone through and then his suicide and all this stuff. I just felt so sick. And then I saw Jesus step in between us, and I saw him just like holding me and just crying too and mad too, and it was just like all the emotions, and we were just together as one. And then I saw him turn. My stepdad was on the other side of Jesus, and it was like he was like repenting. He was on his knees and he was repenting for what he had done. And I saw Jesus turn around and forgive him and then come right back and comfort me. And, this is just something that my mind was able to develop, but it felt so real in my heart. And it was a way that I was able to understand that the position that the Lord was in our healing and also in our forgiveness. And, whether that had happened or not, it still was very real to me. And I then wrote in my journal that morning, a letter to my deceased stepfather, my abuser. And for the first time, I was able to really get out like all the emotion, all that I felt about what had happened, every cuss word I knew, some that I made up. They were all there. And then, as Christ has forgiven me and I want to walk in his purpose and his will for my life, I forgive you. And it wasn't, again, about him. It was about me and my journey, realigning myself with the Lord and being able to walk out that path And so then that day, it wasn't just me saying it anymore. It was me doing it. And I can't explain it other than that spiritual transaction, because I felt so much yucky feelings just gone, and just so much peace filling my life. I felt lighter, like forgiveness was like the scissors that cut that rope that I was always dragging him around. I felt free to move forward in my life and in the calling. And as I was writing this, I remembered my niece Lauren. If the fairy can forgive my aunt, I can forgive her too. And it kind of felt the same way. If God could forgive something as horrible as what my stepfather did, then I can too. And that letter was a big release for me. Corrie ten Boom wrote, "To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover the prisoner was you." I love that. So the next lie, I think that had a lot of power over my life, is the lie that forgiveness excuses the behavior of the person who hurt me. But the truth is, forgiveness acknowledges what was wrong and calls it out for what it was. I think forgiveness stares evil straight in the face. It calls it evil, calls it wrong, and calls it, what it was. And then it chooses to leave that vengeance to God. And in my letter to my stepdad, I really called out the humiliation that I felt, the betrayal, by this person I was supposed to trust, the lies, the pain, the injustice, everything, all of it. And it helped me to understand the power that forgiveness can have, because it's not just glossing over everything and just being the nice Christian, or the nice Catholic or the nice Jew or whoever, wherever you come from. It's not being just this nice person of faith that's just willing to let things go. It's not. It's saying that was wrong, and this is why, and this is how it's affecting me, but I am choosing to do this because for my freedom, my heart, my wholeness, my health, and my relationship with my higher power. I'm choosing this for myself. It doesn't minimize it. And forgiveness is letting someone off the hook for all the pain they've caused, and the justice gets sacrificed. That's the lie. The truth is, forgiveness is letting yourself off the hook and freeing yourself from the pain. Just a lot like what I was talking about with that rope that kept me so connected. It was like, even if my abuser dodges his earthly justice, even if your family doesn't validate your pain or the sin that has been committed against you, even if a jury doesn't make the right decision in your case. The Bible that I read says that God, since the beginning of time, right, has been in your story, and he says that was wrong. And justice matters to God, and we can always trust that he will bring it. So I could hand my vengeance over to the Lord and walk out my freedom. And that was really important for my healing. And forgiveness, this is another lie. Forgiveness equals weakness and makes me vulnerable to getting hurt again. That was something I really bought into, because after my abuse, I really put on like a tough girl mentality, and I can sometimes do that now. That's why I wear camo all the time. But I felt like, again, by releasing that person, that makes me soft, and like people could hurt me again because they know that. But the truth is, forgiveness is an act of strength. It's an act of empowerment. Forgiveness, I believe, also teaches other people how you deserve to be treated. Because if I say, this is not okay, but I'm forgiving, but it's not okay, I'm calling out my boundaries, and I am saying, this is not okay. This is how you are to treat me. You can forgive the one who's hurt you, yet still be suspicious and careful of that person. Offering forgiveness doesn't automatically mean you're going to trust somebody again. You have to be gracious, but you have to be smart. And I love the verse in the Bible, Matthew 10:16, that calls us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Because there's people in this world who will always be out to hurt us, right? There really are. So forgiveness doesn't equal trust. Therefore, it doesn't require us to be vulnerable to them again. It just states the boundary. It calls out their treatment as wrong. And forgiveness cuts that cord and allows people who once controlled you, whether they were alive or not, to no longer have that control. That's not vulnerability. That's strength. That's empowerment. When I talk about that, and I wrote about this in Hush too, it always makes me picture, did you ever see when like parents would have these kitty leashes? They would like be in the mall with their kids, like connected to their wrists. It's so weird. I mean, to me, that's abuse, but like that poor kid. But it just reminds me of that, those Velcro wrists and stuff. So, but just being able to have your freedom again and the scissors of forgiveness is so powerful. The next lie, forgiveness means I have to have a relationship with the person who hurt me. But the truth is, that doesn't even fit. Sorry, I'll read it. Forgiveness and reconciliation are two completely different things. Forgiveness never requires a relationship or even a confrontation. The Hebrew root of the word forgive is actually to send away. That's the Hebrew root of the word forgive, to send away. So with reconciliation, you're walking out the process of forgiveness, the process of sending away, the process of cutting that cord, right? Sending away, walking in your own freedom. But then with reconciliation, you can come back to the table, right? With repentance on both sides, a desire for a restored relationship on both sides. So ultimately, reconciliation requires something from both people. And oftentimes the other person never will get there. But to put them both in the same category is completely wrong. And it takes a lot to be able to come back to the table together. Reconciliation will always move you forward, never backward to the way it used to be. I think that's very important to remember too. And it's not anything that you should ever rush, for sure. The next lie is forgiveness is the first step of the healing process. But the truth is forgiveness is part of a very, very long process of healing and is never, ever, ever the first step. And that's something I think people in the church get wrong more often than not. For me, I think that sometimes the first step of forgiveness is actually realizing that the other person's an idiot. Like that's really helped me in a lot of my relationships. Like that's the first step. And then you move on from there. But for the healing process, especially healing from something like trauma or abuse, there's so many steps that come first. I talked about that last night. Like telling your story, your secret, your pain, that's the first step. And then being able to work through some of the lies you believe, especially like the lie that it was your fault, that you'd asked for it or deserved it. These are things that have to come way first. For me, myself, as an abuse survivor, I carried that, like the idea that the abuse was my fault for so long. So if the abuse was my fault, how could I ever forgive somebody else, right? So I needed to be angry. I needed to then deal with what came from that. I needed to understand, oh my goodness, like as a little girl, I wasn't at fault. It was his fault. And now that I have that understanding, now I have something to actually forgive. So when someone comes along and says, well, you need to forgive that person, that isn't helpful at all because I had nothing to forgive him for. I need to work through all the other steps first. I had to put blame where it belongs. I had to have that righteous anger at injustice. I had to accept my own forgiveness before I could then offer forgiveness to somebody else. Scripture constantly reiterates one message about forgiveness, and that's forgiven people can forgive, right? God forgives us in Jesus and enables us to then forgive others. So it's this process that we're always going through. And I do think that it's important to know, if you're a leader, especially in a church, there's so many well-meaning pastors, counselors, friends, family who cause a great deal of harm by pushing forgiveness as the first step for an abuse survivor. That is one of the most common, destructive, harmful pieces of advice that I have found in my 17 years of working with survivors. Is well-meaning leaders telling a survivor that forgiveness is the first step. It puts this pressure on survivors to jump way past these so important pieces of healing that need to come first. And it damages their trust with you as a leader. You'll no longer be a safe place for them as soon as you offer that up. So you have to be an open ear. You have to speak truth to the lies about who they are as a person, about the abuse, the fault, all of those things. They need reminded that it wasn't their fault, that they didn't deserve it, that there's nothing they could have done to ask for this. And then forgiveness comes in time. And you can pray in your own quiet time about how fast that might be, but that's not something you communicate with that survivor. You need to know healing's a lifelong journey, and it might take a very, very long time for them to ever get there. And we just have to keep letting God do his work. And we love them in the process, and we listen to the hard things and keep pointing them to him. But I think that part is something that God himself will be able to share with that person. It's not to come out of your mouth. The next one, forgiveness is a feeling. The truth is, forgiveness is not an emotion. What I found is it's a decision. It's something that I don't ever feel like doing, but it's something that I've had to choose to do because I know the power that comes from it. C.S. Lewis said something about love, and I think it's true about forgiveness too. He said, the more we act like we love someone, doing the kind thing, assuming the best intentions, the more we'll find that our feelings follow our actions. And then Corrie ten Boom shared a story. Actually, I think we're coming close. I'm not going to share that story. I'll tell you later. The next lie, though, forgiveness is a one and done act of the will. And the truth is, forgiveness is a process, and it often needs revisited many times. And it kind of goes along with what I was saying about it is a choice that, for me and myself, I've had to make many, many times. We can't force ourselves to let go of something in just a single moment and then it's over, right? Richard Rohr, I don't know if any of you have heard of him. I really like his work. He says, we do not think ourselves into new ways of living. We live ourselves into new ways of thinking. It's this ongoing process of letting go, and of revisiting and of reprocessing. And that's been very helpful in my life. You have to revisit these things over and over again. And the last one. The lie is when you forgive, you also forget. How many times have we heard that, But the truth is, forgiving and forgetting are very different things, and they don't belong in the same sentence. I once heard someone say, forgive your enemies, but never forget their names. I've held on to that in my life. But I think simplistic, trite answers like forgive and forget are also very harmful. Or forgiveness, is the first step to healing. It demeans someone who's gone through something really horrible. And it picks at the wound that they are walking around with every day. They're not helpful. They might make you feel better by saying it, but it doesn't help the person, right? Forgiving someone takes time and it takes work and it takes practice. It really does. And forgetting what happened is not even possible for a lot of us. Nor is it even wise. You can't make yourself forget something, especially something as deep as sexual trauma. It's not like our minds have that recycle bin like our computers do. You just can't just throw it in the trash and then make it go away. It just doesn't work that way. And I think it becomes very dangerous for a victim of crime, especially, to be told things like that. Forgiving is something we can do for our own health, our own well-being, but forgetting is something separate and totally different, and oftentimes not even accessible for us. So, again, as I've read forgiveness scriptures throughout, my healing journey as a follower of Jesus, it's been hard at times, but as I've come to understand the truth of what forgiveness really looks like, it's actually been quite freeing and quite enlightening and very empowering for me to know that there are things that in my story I have control over. And then, I remember feeling like I was connected to my abuser by that cord for so long. It was like I could see Jesus in the distance and I just wanted to be following him and closer to him, but I felt so much closer to my abuser. It was like I was running in place because that cord was there. But then the scissors of forgiveness that cut me free to be able to just fully run freely, there was nothing holding me back anymore. That's what forgiveness was for me. And it's hard for me to explain it to people who have not gone through that process, because I know what it feels like to be like, no way. But I also know what it's like to have gotten there, and the freedom is unmatched. And what I've understood for my life is that this radical message of Jesus and forgiveness and all of that, is that God would take all of the brokenness, all the shame. You know, at 14 years old, 1 week after I told my stepdad took his life, that same day, the same 5 minutes that I heard the news that my stepfather had taken his life, I vowed I was never going to tell anyone again. My secret would never be known. No one would know that I was a sexual abuse survivor. I was so ashamed. But that radical message of forgiveness and what God could do with my life if I really was able to run after him freely is what has empowered me to not only find my voice, but to use it, as an advocate in the world. And I'm just so grateful. And I know that, we all come in here with shameful stories, baggage, all of that. But like that message, I think, can carry over to all of our stories, because all of our stories matter. All of our stories can be used for good in the world. And so that's my message. And that's what forgiveness is. So thank you.